I was staring out my kitchen window at the 3-foot mountain of snow. I had just spent 2 hours shoveling into a neat pile on the edge of my driveway, when I heard the unmistakable roar of an engine revving way too hard for a residential street in Burlington, Vermont. The silver Lexus SUV came barreling around the corner, fishtailing slightly on the icy road, and before I could even process what was happening, it plowed straight into my carefully constructed snow pile with a sickening crunch. My name is Patrick Zimmerman, and I had lived in the Maple Ridge community for exactly 8 months. I bought my modest 3-bedroom colonial after my divorce was finalized, thinking a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood would be good for my mental health. What I didn't know when I signed those papers was that our homeowners association was run by a woman who made Cruella de Vil look reasonable. I dropped my coffee mug in the sink and rushed outside, not even bothering to grab my coat. The cold January air hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed as I jogged down my driveway. The SUV had come to a stop about 15 feet past my property line, its front bumper slightly crumpled, snow and ice chunks scattered everywhere like an explosion at a winter carnival. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Deborah Weatherby, the HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood property values. She was in her late 40s, with that particular haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," and designer workout clothes that had probably never seen the inside of an actual gym. Her face was already red, and not from the cold. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she screeched before I could even ask if she was okay. "Why would you put a massive snow pile right where people drive?" I blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity. "That pile was on my property, Deborah, on the edge of my driveway. You were on the wrong side of the road. Don't you dare try to blame this on me." She pointed a manicured finger at my face, her voice reaching a pitch that probably had dogs howling 3 streets over. "You deliberately placed that snow pile to obstruct traffic. This is a clear violation of HOA regulations regarding property maintenance and safety hazards." "I shoveled my driveway and put the snow on my own lawn," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice level. "That's literally what everyone in this neighborhood does when it snows." What was I supposed to do with it? Make it disappear? Deborah pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of her damaged bumper, then of the remnants of my snow pile. "I'm documenting everything. This is going in my report to the HOA board. You're going to pay for the damage to my vehicle, and you're getting fined for creating a hazardous condition." By this point, a few neighbors had started to emerge from their houses. Tom Rodriguez from across the street was standing on his porch with his arms crossed, shaking his head. The elderly couple next door, the Patels, were peering out their window with concerned expressions. "Deborah, you crashed into my snow pile because you were driving too fast on an icy road," I said, my patience starting to wear thin. "Look at the tire marks. You came around that corner way over the center line." She whirled on me, eyes blazing. "Are you calling me a reckless driver? I've been driving for 30 years without an accident. This is entirely your fault. That snow pile was a visual obstruction and a hazard." Section 12. Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that no homeowner shall create conditions that impede safe passage or visibility on community streets. I had read the HOA bylaws when I moved in, mostly out of paranoid caution after hearing horror stories from friends who dealt with power-hungry HOA boards. Section 12, Paragraph 4 was about not parking vehicles in ways that blocked sight lines at intersections. It had absolutely nothing to do with snow removal. "That section is about parked cars at corners," I said. "My snow pile was on my driveway, at least 8 feet from the edge of the street. You'd have to deliberately drive onto my property to hit it, which is exactly what you did. I'm calling the police, Deborah announced, already dialing. We'll let them sort out who's at fault here. Great idea, I replied, pulling out my own phone. I'll call them too, and I'm getting footage from my doorbell camera. It records everything. Her expression flickered for just a moment, a crack in the armor of righteous indignation. I had installed a Ring doorbell camera 3 months ago after someone kept leaving passive-aggressive notes on my door about my garbage cans being visible from the street. I'd had a feeling it would come in handy eventually, though I never imagined it would be for something like this. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. Officer Jenkins was a young guy, probably late 20s, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd already responded to too many idiotic calls that day. His partner, Officer Martinez, was older and looked even less impressed with the situation. Deborah immediately launched into her version of events, gesticulating wildly and using words like reckless endangerment and property destruction and willful negligence. She made it sound like I had spent my morning strategically engineering an elaborate trap specifically designed to total her vehicle. Officer Jenkins listened politely, taking notes, then turned to me. "Sir, can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" I explained the situation calmly, showing him where the snow pile had been located on my property, pointing out the tire tracks that clearly showed Deborah's vehicle had veered significantly off course. Then, I pulled up the Ring app on my phone. "I have video footage if you want to see exactly what happened," I offered. Deborah's face went pale. "That's an invasion of privacy. You can't just record people without their consent." Officer Martinez spoke up for the first time, his voice dry. "Madam, doorbell cameras are legal. If you're on someone's property or visible from their property, there's no expectation of privacy." We all huddled around my phone screen watching the footage. It was pretty damning. The timestamp showed Deborah's SUV approaching the corner at what was clearly too high a speed for the icy conditions. As she turned, the vehicle slid wide, crossing over into the wrong lane entirely. She overcorrected, the SUV fishtailed, and then she plowed directly into my snow pile, which was very obviously several feet onto my lawn, nowhere near the actual traveled portion of the road. Officer Jenkins looked up from the screen. "Madam, based on this footage, it appears you were exceeding safe speeds for the road conditions and failed to maintain control of your vehicle. The snow pile was clearly on private property, not obstructing the roadway." "But it was still a hazard," Deborah insisted, her voice getting shrill again. "It was blocking visibility." "Of what?" Officer Martinez asked. "It's on the side of a straight residential road. There's no intersection there, no crosswalk, nothing that would require clear sight lines at that specific point." Deborah opened and closed her mouth like a fish, struggling to come up with a response. Finally, she switched tactics. "Fine, but he's still in violation of HOA regulations. The board will be hearing about this and there will be consequences." Officer Jenkins sighed. "Madam, HOA regulations aren't criminal matters. We're here to determine if any traffic laws were broken or if there's property damage that rises to a criminal level. From what I can see, you lost control of your vehicle on icy roads and drove onto Mr. Zimmerman's property, damaging his snow pile. If anything, he could potentially file a complaint against you for property damage, though I'm not sure it would go anywhere." "My vehicle is damaged," Deborah protested. "Due to your own driving," Officer Martinez pointed out. "Look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not issuing any citations right now because, honestly, this is a civil matter. Mr. Zimmerman's property wasn't damaged beyond a snow pile, which isn't exactly permanent. Your vehicle has minor damage that appears to be the result of your own actions. You two need to work this out between yourselves or through your insurance companies. The HOA stuff is completely separate and not our jurisdiction." After the officers left, making it very clear they considered this a waste of their time, Deborah glared at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Patrick, not even close. I'm calling an emergency HOA board meeting and you're going to face serious consequences for this stunt." "What stunt?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "I shoveled my driveway. You crashed into my property. How is any of this my fault?" She stomped back to her SUV without answering, examined the damage to her bumper one more time with a theatrical wince, then climbed in and drove away at a much more reasonable speed. Tom Rodriguez walked over, shaking his head. "Man, you really stepped in it now. Deborah's going to make your life hell over this." "She already makes everyone's life hell," I muttered. "Remember when she fined the Patels $300 because their mailbox was painted cream instead of white? Or when she sent certified letters to half the street demanding we all repaint our shutters because the black was too dark and creating visual discord," Tom added. "I'm just saying, be prepared. She's vindictive when she doesn't get her way." He wasn't wrong. Over the next week, I received no fewer than 5 separate notices from the HOA. The first was a formal complaint about the snow pile incident demanding I appear before the board. The second was a fine of $500 for creating a traffic hazard. The third was a violation notice for having my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours after collection. The fourth was a complaint that my window wreaths were still up past the holiday decoration removal deadline of January 7th. The fifth was a notice that my lawn maintenance was substandard because there were visible dead patches in my grass, which was currently under 8 inches of snow. I sat at my kitchen table, spreading out the letters like a bad hand of cards, and seriously questioned my life choices. My buddy Marcus, who worked as a real estate lawyer, had warned me about HOAs when I was house hunting. I dismissed his concerns, figuring that as long as I kept my property reasonably maintained and didn't paint my house fluorescent orange, I'd be fine. I hadn't accounted for Deborah Weatherby. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center, a bland rectangular building that primarily hosted yoga classes and kids' birthday parties. I arrived 15 minutes early, mostly because I wanted to secure a seat where I could see everyone and not have my back to the door. The room was already half full of neighbors, some looking sympathetic, others clearly there for the entertainment value of watching someone get roasted by the board. The HOA board consisted of 5 members. Deborah was the president. Her right-hand woman was Linda Hutchins, the vice president, who was basically Deborah's echo chamber. Then there was Richard Crowley, the treasurer, a retired accountant who treated HOA funds like they were the federal budget. Jennifer Wu was the secretary, a quiet woman who always looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. And finally, there was Marcus Brennan, not to be confused with my friend Marcus, who served as the member-at-large and was the only person on the board with a shred of common sense. The meeting was called to order at 7:03. Deborah sat at the center of the long table at the front of the room, wearing a navy blue blazer that she probably thought made her look official, but really just made her look like she was cosplaying a discount politician. "We're here tonight to address a serious safety violation by one of our residents," Deborah began, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that fooled absolutely nobody. "On January 14th, Patrick Zimmerman created a dangerous obstruction on his property that resulted in a traffic accident. This kind of reckless behavior cannot be tolerated in our community. I raised my hand. "Can I speak?" "You'll have your turn," Deborah said dismissively. "First, I want to present the evidence of your negligence." She proceeded to show photos of her damaged bumper, photos of the scattered snow, and photos of my driveway that made it look like I had constructed some kind of snow fortress designed to terrorize passing motorists. What she didn't show was the Ring camera footage that clearly demonstrated her own terrible driving. "The bylaws are very clear," Deborah continued. Section 12, Paragraph 4 states that no homeowner shall create conditions that impede safe passage. Mr. Zimmerman's snow pile was a clear impediment. "That section is about parking cars at intersections," I interjected. "My driveway isn't near an intersection." "Let him speak when it's his turn," Linda Hutchins snapped. Marcus Brennan leaned forward. "Actually, I think he has a point." "Can we pull up Section 12, Paragraph 4? I want to read it word for word." Jennifer Wu, looking uncomfortable, pulled out a binder and flipped through it. She read aloud, "No homeowner shall park or permit to be parked any vehicle at any intersection in such a manner as to impede visibility or safe passage of other vehicles or pedestrians." "It says vehicle," Marcus Brennan pointed out. "A snow pile isn't a vehicle." "The spirit of the law clearly applies," Deborah argued, her face reddening. "The intent is to prevent obstructions." "With respect, Deborah, we can't just apply bylaws based on what we think the spirit might be," Marcus said. "That's not how regulations work. If the bylaw says vehicle, it means vehicle. If we wanted it to cover snow piles or other objects, we should have written it that way." "Are you taking his side?" Deborah demanded. "I'm taking the side of accurate interpretation of our own rules," Marcus replied calmly. I decided it was time to present my evidence. "I have video footage from my doorbell camera showing exactly what happened. Can I show it?" Deborah looked like she wanted to refuse, but with half the neighborhood watching and Marcus Brennan clearly paying attention to procedural fairness, she didn't have much choice. "Fine. Make it quick." I connected my phone to the community center's projector, a process that took way longer than it should have because the Wi-Fi was terrible and the cord was ancient. Finally, the footage appeared on the screen. The room went silent as everyone watched Deborah's SUV speed around the corner, slide across the road, and plow into my snow pile. When it finished, there was a long moment of quiet. Then someone in the back row said, "Looks like she was driving pretty fast." "The roads were icy," someone else added. "You've got to slow down in those conditions." Deborah's face had gone from red to purple. "This is irrelevant. The fact remains that the snow pile shouldn't have been there in the first place." "Where should it have been?" I asked. "I shoveled my driveway. The snow had to go somewhere. I put it on my own lawn several feet from the road. That's what everyone does." "You could have distributed it more evenly," Deborah said. "I could have," I agreed, "but there's no rule saying I have to." "Show me the bylaw that regulates how I pile snow on my own property." Jennifer Wu was frantically flipping through the binder again. "There's nothing specific about snow removal or placement," she said quietly. Richard Crowley, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "I move that we table this complaint pending a review of relevant bylaws. It doesn't appear that Mr. Zimmerman violated any existing regulations." "I second that," Marcus Brennan said immediately. Deborah looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. "Fine. But we still have 4 other violations to address. Mr. Zimmerman's garbage cans were visible from the street on January 16th for more than 2 hours after collection." I pulled out my phone again. "I have a time-stamped photo showing my cans were back in my garage by 9:30 a.m. Collection happens at 7 a.m. on my street. That's 2.5 hours, which is within the 4-hour window specified in Section 8. Your holiday decorations were still up past the deadline, Linda Hutchins jumped in. I took them down on January 7th, I said. The deadline is January 7th. I complied exactly on time. They should have been down before January 7th, Deborah insisted. That's not what the bylaw says, Marcus Brennan interjected again, looking increasingly annoyed. The deadline is January 7th at 11:59 p.m. If he took them down at any point on January 7th, he's in compliance. This was rapidly turning into a circus. Deborah and Linda kept trying to find ways to make their bogus violations stick, while Marcus Brennan and Richard Crowley pushed back on the obvious overreach. Jennifer Wu mostly looked miserable and stayed quiet. The audience was eating it up, whispering and occasionally laughing at the more absurd claims. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of back and forth, Marcus Brennan stood up. I'm making a formal motion. All violations and fines against Patrick Zimmerman related to the snow pile incident, and the subsequent complaints are dismissed due to lack of merit. Furthermore, I'm proposing that this board undergo training on proper interpretation and application of HOA bylaws because this meeting has been an embarrassment. I second the motion, Richard Crowley said firmly. They called for a vote. Marcus and Richard voted in favor. Jennifer Wu, after a long hesitation during which Deborah glared at her with the intensity of 1,000 suns, also voted in favor. Deborah and Linda voted against. 3-2. The motion passed. I walked out of that community center feeling vindicated but also knowing that this was far from over. Deborah Weatherby didn't strike me as the type to let go of a grudge, especially not one that had embarrassed her in front of the entire neighborhood. I was right. 2 days later, I received a notice that my property was being inspected for code compliance issues. Deborah showed up at my door at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning with a clipboard, a camera, and Linda Hutchins in tow like a particularly unpleasant shadow. This is a formal inspection, Deborah announced when I answered the door in my pajamas. As HOA president, I have the authority to conduct inspections to ensure all properties meet community standards. You need to give 24 hours notice, I said, remembering that specific bylaw from my paranoid reading sessions. Section 19, Paragraph 2. This is an emergency inspection, Deborah countered. Emergency inspections can be conducted without notice. What's the emergency? We received complaints about your property maintenance. From who? That's confidential. I seriously considered closing the door in her face, but I knew that would just escalate things further. Fine. Inspect away. Just stay out of my house. You can look at anything visible from outside the property. They spent the next 45 minutes walking around my house, taking photos and making notes. I watched from my window as they scrutinized every inch of my property like forensic investigators at a crime scene. At one point, Deborah got down on her hands and knees to photograph a tiny crack in my driveway that I'd never even noticed before. When they finally left, I knew I was in for another avalanche of violation notices. Sure enough, over the next week, I received complaints about the crack in my driveway. Uneven grass height, despite it being winter and the grass being dormant. A slightly faded mailbox post, and improperly stored recycling bins that were apparently 3 inches over the property line into my own backyard. Each violation came with a fine ranging from $100 to $500. The total was over $2,000. I called Marcus, my lawyer friend, and laid out the entire situation. He listened quietly, occasionally making sympathetic noises, then said, "Patrick, you need to fight this. What she's doing is harassment, plain and simple. Most of these violations are either completely made up or so minor that no reasonable person would enforce them. The problem is that fighting an HOA can be expensive and time-consuming. What are my options? You can request a formal hearing, present evidence that the violations are bogus, and hope the board sides with you. But from what you've told me, the board is split, and Deborah has at least 2 people who will back her no matter what. Your other option is to lawyer up and potentially sue the HOA for harassment, but that's a long road. There has to be something else. Marcus was quiet for a moment. There might be. If you can prove that Deborah is abusing her authority as HOA president for personal vendetta purposes, you could potentially call for a special election to remove her from the board. But you'd need evidence, and you'd need community support. Evidence. I thought about that. I started asking around the neighborhood, casually at first, just chatting with people when I saw them out walking their dogs or checking their mail. What I discovered was that I was far from the only person who'd been targeted by Deborah's reign of terror. Tom Rodriguez told me about the time Deborah had fined him $800 because his daughter's birthday party exceeded the acceptable noise level for residential areas at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. The Patels shared stories about constant harassment over minor cosmetic issues, including the infamous mailbox incident. A young couple 3 houses down, the Harrigans, told me they'd been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden in their backyard that was supposedly visible from the street and aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. The more I talked to people, the more I realized that Deborah had been systematically bullying residents for years. Most people just paid the fines and tried to fly under the radar because fighting back seemed impossible. I started documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet tracking all the violations Deborah had issued over the past 2 years, using information from public HOA records that were technically available to all residents, but that nobody ever actually looked at. The pattern was stunning. Deborah had issued over 300 violations in 24 months, with fines totaling more than $70,000. The neighborhood only had 52 houses. Even more interesting was who got targeted. People who had ever disagreed with Deborah or questioned her decisions received significantly more violations than those who kept their heads down. The Patels had been fined 23 times, Tom Rodriguez 14 times, the Harrigans 18 times. Meanwhile, Linda Hutchins had 0 violations. Richard Crowley, who mostly sided with Deborah, had 1 minor violation in 2 years. Jennifer Wu had 3. Marcus Brennan, who had started pushing back more recently, had racked up 7 violations in the past 6 months alone. This wasn't HOA governance. It was a protection racket. I compiled all my evidence into a detailed presentation and started reaching out to neighbors individually, showing them the data. People were shocked. Many of them hadn't realized how systematic the targeting was because they'd only seen their own violations, not the bigger picture. "We should call for a vote to remove her," Tom said when I showed him the spreadsheet. "This is insane." "We need 40% of homeowners to petition for a special election," I explained. "That's 21 households. Then we need a majority vote to actually remove her, which is 27 households." "I'll sign," Tom said immediately, "and I'll talk to people. This has gone on long enough." Over the next 2 weeks, I went door to door like I was running for office. Some people were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. Others were eager to finally do something about the Deborah problem. The Patels signed immediately. The Harrigans signed. Marcus Brennan signed and offered to help organize. We hit 21 signatures on a cold Tuesday evening when Margaret Foster, an elderly widow who lived alone at the end of the street, invited me in for tea and told me about how Deborah had fined her repeatedly for having overgrown bushes. despite the fact that Margaret had severe arthritis and could barely manage basic yard work. "She knows I struggle," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "She knows I'm on a fixed income, but she keeps sending those fines and I keep paying them because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. Last month, I had to skip buying my heart medication because I needed that money to pay an HOA fine." That statement hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just petty neighborhood drama anymore. Deborah's power trip was literally affecting people's health and well-being. "Sign the petition," I said quietly. "We're going to fix this." With 21 signatures secured, I submitted the formal petition for a special election according to HOA bylaws. Deborah had to acknowledge receipt within 5 business days and schedule the election within 30 days. Her response arrived via certified mail. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression. She acknowledged the petition, questioned the validity of several signatures, claimed that 3 of the signatories weren't current on their HOA dues, and therefore their signatures didn't count, and announced that she would be conducting a thorough review before scheduling any election. I called Marcus, the lawyer, again. "Can she do this? Can she just stall indefinitely?" "Not legally," he said. "The bylaws are pretty clear. If you have the required signatures from members in good standing, she has to schedule the election. If those 3 people she's claiming are behind on dues can prove they're actually current, she has no grounds to delay." I contacted the 3 homeowners in question. All of them had receipts proving they'd paid their dues on time. One of them, a software engineer named David Park, was furious. "She's lying. She's straight up lying to avoid the election." "Looks that way," I confirmed. "That's fraud," David said. "That's actual fraud." He had a point. Deborah wasn't just being difficult. She was falsifying records to disenfranchise homeowners and maintain her power. That crossed a line from petty tyrant to potential criminal behavior. I sent a formal response to Deborah, copying all board members, with documentation proving that all 21 signatures were valid and that all signatories were current on dues. I also included a politely worded but firm statement that any further delays would be considered a violation of HOA bylaws and could result in legal action. Marcus Brennan, the board member, sent me a private email that evening. "Thank you for putting this together. I've wanted someone to challenge Deborah for years, but I couldn't do it alone. The election is scheduled for February 21st. Be prepared for her to fight dirty." The election was set for a Tuesday evening, again at the community center. In the weeks leading up to it, Deborah launched a full-scale campaign to save her position. She sent out a glossy mailer to every house in the neighborhood highlighting all her accomplishments as HOA president, which apparently included maintaining property values, enforcing community standards, and creating a safe and beautiful environment. The mailer didn't mention the $70,000 in fines or the systematic harassment. She also started suddenly being nice to people, which was disturbing to witness. She smiled at neighbors she'd previously terrorized. She organized a neighborhood coffee social. She even personally helped Margaret Foster with some yard work, in a transparent attempt to make Margaret reconsider her support for the recall. It didn't work. Margaret told me privately, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 32 years. I know manipulation when I see it." I didn't have the money for glossy mailers, but I had the spreadsheet. I printed out copies and distributed them at the coffee social that Deborah had organized, which probably wasn't the most diplomatic move, but was extremely effective. People stood around comparing notes, realizing for the first time how many of their neighbors had been targeted. "She fined you $300 for what?" Someone asked the Patels. "Our mailbox was cream instead of white," Mrs. Patel replied. We had to repaint it twice before she approved the color. I got fined because my kid's basketball hoop was improperly positioned. Another neighbor chimed in. It was in my own driveway. Deborah watched this exchange with barely contained rage, her fake smile growing more strained by the minute. The night of the election, the community center was packed. Every single one of the 52 households had at least one representative present. The energy in the room was tense, like everyone knew this was a pivotal moment for the neighborhood. The process was straightforward. A simple majority vote on whether to remove Deborah Weatherby from her position as HOA president and from the board entirely. If the vote succeeded, a new election for the vacant position would be scheduled within 60 days. Deborah gave a speech before the vote. She talked about her dedication to the community, her years of service, how she'd worked tirelessly to maintain standards and property values. She painted herself as a misunderstood public servant, someone who made tough decisions for the greater good. Then I gave my speech. I kept it simple. I pulled up the spreadsheet on the projector and walked through the numbers. 300 violations in 2 years. $70,000 in fines. Systematic targeting of anyone who disagreed with her. I talked about Margaret Foster having to skip heart medication to pay bogus fines. I talked about the Patels being harassed over a mailbox color. I talked about my own experience with the snow pile incident and how Deborah had tried to blame me for her bad driving. This isn't about governance, I concluded. This is about power and control. We deserve better. The vote was conducted by secret ballot. Jennifer Wu, as secretary, collected and counted them while everyone waited in anxious silence. Final tally. 43 votes to remove Deborah, 9 votes to keep her. It wasn't even close. Deborah's face went through several interesting color changes as Jennifer announced the results. She stood up, grabbed her purse and walked toward the exit. Then she stopped, turned around and pointed at me. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice cold. "All of you. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without proper leadership and it'll be on your heads." "I think we'll manage," Tom Rodriguez called out, and several people laughed. After Deborah stormed out, there was a moment of collective exhale, like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath for years. People started talking, laughing, hugging. It felt like the end of a particularly oppressive era. But the story didn't end there. 3 days after the election, I was at work when I got a call from Officer Martinez, one of the cops who'd responded to the snow pile incident. "Mr. Zimmerman, we need to talk to you about Deborah Weatherby." My stomach dropped. "What did she do now? Can you come down to the station? There's been a development." I left work early and drove to the Burlington Police Department, my mind racing through possibilities. When I arrived, Officer Martinez led me to a small conference room where Officer Jenkins was waiting with another detective I didn't recognize. "Mr. Zimmerman, I'm Detective Sarah Chen." The woman introduced herself. "We're investigating allegations of financial fraud related to your HOA. Your name came up as someone who's been actively challenging Miss Weatherby's leadership." "Financial fraud," I repeated. "We received an anonymous tip that HOA funds have been misappropriated," Detective Chen explained. "The tip included some pretty specific details. We're reaching out to board members and residents to get a fuller picture." She showed me documents, bank statements from the HOA accounts. The numbers were startling. According to the official records, the HOA had collected over $200,000 in dues and fines over the past 3 years. The account balance was just under $30,000. "Where did the rest of the money go?" I asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Detective Chen said. "The expense reports show some legitimate costs. landscaping for common areas, insurance, maintenance. But there are also a lot of vague entries. Administrative expenses, consulting fees, community improvement projects. No receipts, no detailed breakdowns. I thought about Richard Crowley, the treasurer. Has Richard Crowley, the board treasurer, seen these statements? We spoke with Mr. Crowley this morning, Officer Jenkins said. He claims he's been asking Miss Weatherby for detailed expense reports for over a year, but she kept putting him off, saying she'd provide them at the annual budget meeting. The annual meeting kept getting postponed. So she's been embezzling HOA funds, I said slowly. We can't make that determination yet, Detective Chen cautioned. But it's certainly suspicious. We're getting a warrant for her personal financial records. In the meantime, we need to freeze the HOA accounts to preserve any remaining funds and prevent further unauthorized transfers. Over the next few weeks, the investigation unfolded like something out of a true crime podcast. Detectives discovered that Deborah had been systematically siphoning money from the HOA accounts for nearly 3 years. The administrative expenses were personal purchases. The consulting fees were payments to her own private LLC that didn't actually provide any services. The community improvement projects were renovations to her own house. She'd stolen over $120,000. The neighborhood was in shock. Even people who'd supported Deborah, or at least tolerated her, couldn't believe the scope of the fraud. Linda Hutchins, her former vice president and loyal supporter, gave an interview to the local news claiming she'd had no idea, which nobody really believed but couldn't disprove. Deborah was arrested on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Her mugshot made the front page of the Burlington Free Press. In the photo, she looked smaller somehow, less intimidating without her clipboard and her authority. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes do. Deborah hired an expensive lawyer and tried to argue that the money had been used for legitimate HOA purposes, that the records were just poorly maintained, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. Receipts for luxury vacations charged to HOA accounts, payments for designer furniture delivered to her house, even a new car, a BMW, that she'd somehow managed to partially finance through HOA funds by claiming it was a community service vehicle. 8 months after her arrest, Deborah Weatherby pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $123,000 to the HOA. Her house was put up for sale to help cover the restitution, and she moved away in disgrace. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had to rebuild. We held a proper election for the board positions. Marcus Brennan became the new president. Tom Rodriguez became vice president. An accountant named Lisa Morneau, who lived 2 streets over, volunteered as treasurer, promising complete financial transparency. Jennifer Wu stayed on as secretary, and I, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to serve as member-at-large. One of our first acts was to review all the violations and fines that Deborah had issued. We reversed the vast majority of them, refunding money where possible. Margaret Foster got back nearly $3,000 in bogus fines. The Patels were refunded, the Harrigans, Tom, me. Almost everyone received at least some money back, funded partly by what remained in the HOA accounts and partly by the restitution payments as they came in. We rewrote the bylaws to include better oversight mechanisms, clearer violation procedures, and term limits for board members. No more dictators for life. We established a formal appeals process for any violations, so residents couldn't just be arbitrarily fined without recourse. The neighborhood started to feel like an actual community instead of a police state. People talked to each other without fear of being reported. Kids played in yards without their parents worrying about noise complaints. Someone painted their front door teal, which was technically a non-approved color, and nobody cared because it looked nice, and it was their house. About a year after Deborah's arrest, I was out shoveling my driveway after a fresh snowfall, piling the snow in the exact same spot where she'd crashed. Tom walked over with 2 beers, and we stood there in the cold, drinking and watching the sun set over the white-covered neighborhood. "Think she's learned her lesson?" Tom asked. "Probably not," I said. "People like Deborah don't really learn lessons, they just get bitter about getting caught." "Fair point," Tom agreed. "Hey, HOA meeting next Tuesday. We're voting on whether to allow decorative lawn gnomes." Seriously. Seriously. Apparently it's a very contentious issue. Mrs. Patterson wants to put a whole gnome village in her front yard. The Kowalskis think it's tacky. "What do you think?" Tom shrugged. "I think if Mrs. Patterson wants gnomes, she should have gnomes. It's her yard." "That's a very reasonable position." "That's because we're reasonable people," Tom said, clinking his beer bottle against mine. "Unlike some former HOA presidents I could mention. The Tuesday meeting about the gnomes was surprisingly well attended. Apparently, people had strong feelings about decorative lawn art. Mrs. Patterson made an impassioned speech about personal expression and property rights. The Kowalskis countered with concerns about neighborhood aesthetics. We debated for nearly an hour before taking a vote. The gnomes won 14-8, with the rest abstaining. Mrs. Patterson installed her gnome village the following weekend. It was actually kind of charming in a kitschy way. Little gnome houses, gnome gardens, even a tiny gnome fishing in a decorative pond. People drove by slowly to look at it, and most reactions were positive or at least amused. "See," Tom said when we drove past on our way to grab lunch. "Nobody died. The neighborhood didn't collapse into chaos. Gnomes are fine." "Revolutionary concept," I agreed. "Letting people do what they want with their own property as long as it's not actually hurting anyone." My life settled into a comfortable routine. Work during the week, basic property maintenance on weekends, occasional HOA meetings that were actually productive and focused on legitimate community issues like road maintenance and snow removal contracts. I even started dating someone, a teacher named Rachel, who thought the whole Deborah saga was hilarious and only slightly concerning. "So let me get this straight," Rachel said over dinner one night. "This woman crashed into your snow pile, blamed you, tried to fine you thousands of dollars, turned out to be embezzling money, and is now in prison. That's the summary, yes. And you're now on the HOA board yourself," reluctantly. "That's quite a character arc." "I prefer to think of it as refusing to be bullied led to accidentally uncovering a crime," I said. "Very heroic," Rachel teased. "My boyfriend, the HOA vigilante." The 1-year anniversary of Deborah's arrest came and went without much fanfare. The neighborhood had moved on. The restitution payments were slowly coming in, and we'd managed to fully refund almost everyone who'd been unfairly fined. Property values were actually up, despite Deborah's dire predictions of chaos and decay. Then, about 18 months after everything went down, I got a letter. It was from Deborah, postmarked from the correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. My first instinct was to throw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in neat cursive. It started with a bizarre apology that somehow managed to avoid taking any real responsibility. She was sorry I felt hurt by her actions. She was sorry the misunderstanding had escalated. She was sorry that people didn't appreciate her efforts to maintain the neighborhood. Then it took a turn. She blamed me for everything. If I hadn't made such a big deal about the snow pile, none of this would have happened. If I hadn't rallied the neighborhood against her, she wouldn't have been investigated. If I'd just paid the fines and accepted her authority, she'd still be free. The letter concluded with a vague threat about how she'd be released eventually, and would remember everyone who'd betrayed her. I showed the letter to Detective Chen, who'd stayed in touch to update me on the case. She read it, sighed, and said, "This is pretty typical for someone with her personality profile. They never really accept responsibility. It's always someone else's fault. Should I be worried about the threat? I'll make a note of it in her file," Detective Chen said. "It could potentially affect her parole eligibility. But honestly, Mr. Zimmerman, by the time she's released, I doubt she'll have the energy or resources to cause trouble. And if she does, you have a paper trail a mile long documenting her behavior. Any decent judge would grant a restraining order in about 5 seconds." That was reassuring, if not entirely comforting. Life continued. The HOA board functioned smoothly, handling mundane issues like scheduling pool maintenance and organizing the neighborhood 4th of July party. We had our occasional disagreements about policies or priorities, but they were normal disagreements resolved through discussion and voting, not through threats and fines. About 2 years after Deborah's sentencing, I was elected HOA president when Marcus Brennan decided to step down due to work commitments. I'd never imagined myself in that role, but by then, I'd learned enough about HOA governance to feel reasonably confident I wouldn't completely screw it up. My approach was radically different from Deborah's. I sent out a monthly newsletter updating residents on board activities and finances with complete transparency. I held quarterly open forums where anyone could raise concerns or suggestions. I focused on actual community issues like maintaining common areas and organizing social events, not on measuring people's grass height or inspecting mailbox colors. The neighborhood thrived. People actually liked living there, which was apparently a novel concept. We had block parties and holiday gatherings. Kids played together. Adults became actual friends instead of just people who lived near each other in mutual fear of the HOA. One spring afternoon, about 3 years after the snow pile incident, I was planting flowers in my front yard when a car I didn't recognize pulled up. A woman got out, probably in her early 30s, looking uncertain. "Are you Patrick Zimmerman?" she asked. "That's me," I confirmed, standing up and brushing dirt off my hands. "I'm Emily Weatherby," she said. "Deborah's daughter. I wanted to talk to you if you have a few minutes." I'll admit, my first reaction was wariness. But Emily seemed genuinely nervous, not hostile, so I invited her to sit on my porch. I brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, and we sat in silence for a moment before she spoke. "I want to apologize for my mother," Emily said quietly. "I know that doesn't change anything, and I'm not trying to excuse what she did, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in the family is like her." "You're not responsible for your mother's actions," I said. "I know, but I grew up with her, and I saw how she treated people. I saw how she needed to control everything, how she couldn't stand anyone questioning her. I moved across the country partly to get away from it," Emily said. "When I heard what happened, I wasn't surprised. I was embarrassed and angry, but not surprised." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she's going to be released in about 6 months, Emily said. "Her sentence is almost up, and with good behavior, she'll be out. And I wanted to warn you and the neighborhood that she hasn't changed. I've visited her a few times, and she's still convinced that she's the victim, that everyone conspired against her. She talks about you specifically. A lot. That was concerning. What does she say? That you ruined her life, that you turned the neighborhood against her." That you're responsible for her being in prison, Emily said. She's obsessed with it. I've tried to talk to her to get her to take responsibility and move on, but she won't listen. She never listens. You think she'll actually try to do something when she gets out? Emily hesitated. I don't know. She's capable of holding a grudge forever. But she's also almost 60 years old now, and prison hasn't been easy on her. She might just want to disappear and start over somewhere else, or she might try to prove some kind of point. I honestly can't predict it. I thanked Emily for the warning and let her know that we'd take appropriate precautions. After she left, I called an emergency board meeting and explained the situation. We decided to consult with a lawyer about options for protecting the neighborhood and individual residents if Deborah tried to cause trouble. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Gomez who specialized in property law and HOA issues, reviewed everything and advised us to document all our current HOA policies and procedures thoroughly, maintain detailed financial records, and consider filing for a restraining order if Deborah attempted to contact anyone in the neighborhood or showed up on HOA property. From what you've told me, she has a history of harassment and fraud, Patricia said. Any court would take that seriously, especially combined with the threatening letter she sent you. If she violates any restraining order or attempts to interfere with HOA operations, she'd be in violation of her parole and could go back to prison. 6 months later, Deborah was released. According to public records, she moved to Montpelier, about 45 minutes away, and took a job at a retail store. For several months, nothing happened. No contact, no drive-bys, no attempts to interfere with the neighborhood. It seemed like maybe she'd actually decided to move on. Then, about 8 months after her release, I got a call from Marcus Brennan. Patrick, you need to see this. He sent me a link to a website. It was a blog called HOA Corruption Exposed, and it was entirely dedicated to trashing me and the current board. There were posts claiming we were embezzling funds just like Deborah had, that we were running the neighborhood into the ground, that property values were plummeting, that residents were miserable. Every post was anonymous, but the writing style was unmistakable. This is completely false, I said, reading through post after post of made-up violations and fictional scandals. I know, Marcus said, but she's putting it out there and some people might believe it. We consulted with Patricia Gomez again. She reviewed the blog and confirmed it contained demonstrable lies that could be considered defamation. You could potentially sue her for defamation, but honestly, the blog has maybe 50 viewers total, mostly her. It's not worth the cost of litigation unless it starts actually damaging your reputation or causing real harm. Instead, we decided on a different approach. I created our own website, fully transparent, with all HOA financial records, meeting minutes, and resident feedback openly available. Anyone who wanted to verify that Deborah's blog was nonsense could easily do so with actual documentation. I also wrote one blog post of my own, calmly and factually explaining the history of what had happened, including Deborah's conviction, the restitution, and the reforms we'd implemented. I didn't attack her personally or even mention her blog. I just laid out the facts and let them speak for themselves. The contrast was stark. Her blog was angry, rambling accusations with no evidence. Our website was organized, factual, and boring in the best possible way. Anyone doing even basic research would immediately see which source was credible. Deborah's blog continued for a few more months, the posts getting increasingly unhinged, before it suddenly stopped updating. I later learned through Emily, who occasionally checked in with me, that Deborah had gotten in trouble with her parole officer for the blog. Apparently, Posting defamatory content about people connected to your criminal case violated the terms of her parole. She'd been warned to stop or face consequences. The blog stayed up but dormant. Eventually, the domain expired and it disappeared entirely. 4 years after the snow pile incident, the neighborhood was genuinely thriving. We'd completed a renovation of the community center, entirely funded by proper budgeting and transparent spending. We'd organized a neighborhood watch program that actually focused on safety rather than spying on people's trash cans. We'd even won an award from the city of Burlington for community excellence. I was sitting at my kitchen table one Saturday morning, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, when Rachel came downstairs. We'd moved in together 6 months earlier, and she'd integrated seamlessly into neighborhood life, volunteering to organize the kids' Halloween party and the spring cleanup day. "You know what's wild?" she said, pouring herself coffee. "This whole thing started because some angry woman crashed into your snow pile, and then blamed me for it," I added. "And now you're the award-winning HOA president of a happy neighborhood, and she's a convicted felon with a dead blog. Life's funny that way. Think you'll ever see her again?" I shrugged. "Maybe. Burlington's not that big, but honestly, I don't think about her much anymore. We've moved on. The neighborhood's moved on. I hope she has too, wherever she is." Rachel kissed the top of my head. "You're a good guy, Patrick Zimmerman." "Even if you do spend way too much time worrying about HOA bylaws." "Someone has to," I said. "Otherwise, we'd have chaos, gnomes everywhere, teal doors, snow piles on driveways." "The horror," she laughed. "That evening, we went to a neighborhood barbecue at Tom and Maria Rodriguez's house. Practically everyone was there, including the Patels, the Harrigans, Margaret Foster, and a dozen other families. Kids ran around playing tag while adults stood in clusters talking and laughing. Someone had set up a volleyball net, and a competitive game was underway with lots of good-natured trash talk. Tom walked over with a beer in hand. "Good turnout." "Best one yet," I agreed. "Remember when everyone was too scared to even talk to their neighbors because Deborah might find out and issue a violation? Hard to forget. Look at us now," Tom gestured at the crowd. "Actual community. Crazy concept." Marcus Brennan joined us, balancing a plate of food. "I heard Deborah's blog finally died." "Domain expired," I confirmed. "Probably forgot to renew it. Or couldn't afford it," Tom suggested. "Retail jobs don't pay much, and she's got that massive restitution hanging over her." "Think she'll ever pay it all back?" Marcus asked. "Probably not," I said. "But the HOA's finances are solid now. We don't need her money to function. It'd be nice to get it, but we're not dependent on it." "That's the difference between our board and her," Marcus said. "We actually manage things responsibly instead of treating the HOA like a personal piggy bank and power trip." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Someone started playing music, and a few people began dancing. Rachel pulled me into an impromptu waltz that I was terrible at, but she didn't seem to mind. Around us, neighbors talked and laughed and enjoyed each other's company without fear or anxiety. This was what an HOA was supposed to be. Not a tool for one person's ego and control issues, but a genuine organization that helped a community function smoothly and harmoniously. It had taken a crazy woman crashing into my snow pile, a lengthy investigation, a criminal trial, and years of careful rebuilding to get here, but we'd made it. Later that night, after the barbecue wound down and Rachel and I walked home under the stars, she asked, "Do you ever regret moving here? With all the drama and stress," I thought about it. "No, I mean, dealing with Deborah was terrible and I wouldn't want to repeat it. But if I hadn't moved here, she'd probably still be terrorizing everyone, stealing money and making people's lives miserable. The snow pile incident was just the catalyst. Something would have eventually forced a confrontation. So you're saying you're glad she crashed into your snow pile? I'm saying I'm glad we fixed a broken system, I corrected. The snow pile was just the beginning. We reached our house, the porch light glowing warmly. Inside, everything was comfortable and familiar. This was home in a neighborhood that finally felt like a real community. The journey had been stranger and more difficult than I ever could have anticipated when I bought this house, but looking back, I wouldn't change it. Well, maybe I'd change the part where Deborah sent me $2,000 in bogus fines. That part I could have done without, but everything else. The standing up to a bully, the uncovering of fraud, the rebuilding of a community, the friendships formed through shared struggle. That was all worth it. I stood on my porch for a moment, looking at the spot where my snow pile had been 4 winters ago. It seemed like a lifetime had passed since that cold January morning. In many ways, it had. The person I was then, freshly divorced and just looking for a quiet place to rebuild his life, felt like a different man from who I was now. Rachel called from inside, asking if I was coming to bed. I took one last look at the peaceful street, lights glowing in windows up and down the block, and smiled. "Yeah," I called back. "I'm coming." I went inside, locked the door, and didn't think about Deborah Weatherby at all.